Hello guys, welcome to the next video in our series in the Lightning development section of for Salesforce drillers. So let's continue from where we last left off. So we were talking about types of Lightning attributes in the last video, and we were going to talk about custom Apex class type of attributes. We had done the standard basic types, the collection types, and the subject types before this. So I hope that all is clear to you. Okay, so I have my org already opened up, and we have our attribute example app that we built in our last example. And if I preview this, it shows me blank because I don't have anything on my component yet. So let me go back to my component right here. So now we're gonna learn about how to use like custom Apex classes to create attributes for your Aura component. So the first thing that we were discussing in the last session as well was that we need to create a new custom Apex class called, you can name it whatever. So we named our class custom wrapper. Then what we need to do is we need to define the actual members in this class, like the variables. But in order to use this class in your Lightning Aura components, you need to use a notation here called Aura enabled. And you need to use this notation with each variable that you want to use in your Lightning Aura component. So let's say we do public string text, and then we create a number, and we do public integer now. Alright, so I had to define both of these as or enabled, and in order for them to be or enabled, they should be public as well. If I try and define them as not public, this will not work. So let's say we have this custom Apex class, right? And we want to use this in our Lightning component as an attribute. So now we go back to our Lightning component and we define an attribute. We name it as, let's say, CST wrap, which is custom wrapper. And now here is where the important part comes. So when we define the type, we'll just put the custom Apex class's name in our type. And now we have this attribute here, which is of this Apex class's type. Okay. Now, so when we were using our previous attributes, we always used like a default here to specify a default value. So let's try and do that here right now. So again, since this is an object type attribute, we need to define the default in a JSON format. So we'll do something like this. We'll put a text value. Then we have a value as test v. Then the second value we had was an integer number. So we do this and we do its value as 10. Now in my markup, I'm just gonna print out the attribute's name dot. We can access both of these variables now through our attribute in our Lightning component. So I'm gonna print out the text, and then I'm gonna do dot the number as well. Let's, for formatting purposes, let's just put a PR between both of these, right? So now let's say I preview this. So I think I didn't save it already. Yeah, okay. Now I go back and I refresh this. and nothing showed up. Why? Let me open my app again. All right, and then we're gonna do uh, something like this. And then we're gonna refresh it to see if we're gonna get the test value on there. Okay, so as you can see, I mean, the test that I put in here as a hard-coded value, that is being printed out, but these values are not being printed out. So the reason why this does not work is that this default value right here, this does not work with your custom Apex class type attributes. So you guys need to make sure whenever you are using a custom Apex type of your attribute in your Aura component, you don't use this default. So then a question that most of you would be asking is then how do we provide a default value? So there are multiple ways to do it. One of the ways is to have this value being returned from your Apex class. We'll talk about that in later videos. Or you can, give it a default value from your JavaScript as well. And again, that is something we'll look at in later sessions. But for testing purposes for now, this is how you would use your Apex class type attribute. If we populate a value in this attribute, you should be able to access this out like this. We'll do a quick example of this in our next video, but let's just keep it for reference purposes like this for now. Okay. Then, apart from this, the other two types of attributes that are used are function type attributes. So the function type attributes are defined something like this, where I think it's not gonna let me save it right here because I need to expose it, but yeah. And the second thing is, the second last type of attribute that can be defined are framework specific type components, and these are used like when you want to dynamically create or destroy your Aura components. So the syntax for these goes like this. So the type of these is like aura.component. All right. Again, not too much that we want to go through into right now. We want to keep these for later videos. But so apart from this, uh, let's talk about the bound and unbound expressions, or what we learned it as was the exclamation mark operator and the hash operator to refer to a lightning attribute. So let's say I'm going to set up the example. Let's say I put up a string type attribute again, then I put the value in it as my default value, then we print the value of this attribute inside of our markup. Then we have a line break. Then again, we want to create two lightning input fields this time. Let's say we call it bound expression example, and we use the exclamation mark dot read dot text. So and then we're gonna use a second input field, which is gonna be our unbound expression. The only difference which comes is in place of exclamation, you're gonna use the hash operator, right? Okay, so we learned that obviously you can bind an attribute value to the value of this input field, and we can do that in two ways, like using bound expressions and using unbound expressions. So the difference between these is we're going to look at it with an example. So we have the default value in our text attribute loop being loaded as my default. Then we have two input fields. This is our bound expression. This is our unbound expression. So if I change the value in my bound expression input like this, so you'll see that the text attributes value also gets updated on the top. But if I don't change, I change the value in my unbound expression, then the value is not changed on the script level. So what this means is when we use like a bound expression, the value is binded from both sides. It's a two-way data bind. So where if you change this text attributes value anywhere, it will be reflected everywhere we have used this bound expression. So if we, let's say, change the value of this default, it will be reflected here, the new changed value, and here as well. So what's happening is, if we go back, we refresh it, we are changing the value of the attribute with an input field, and wherever we have used the bound expressions like here and here, the updated value is being shown to us. But in the case of unbound expressions, what happens is the value is populated only on the load of the component. So when this component was loaded, my default value was loaded in the unbound expression. And then after that, any change in this text attribute will not be reflected in the case of unbound expressions. All right. Now, just as we have like taken into example this with a lightning input, we can also uh, take this example with a child or a component. What I mean by that is, let's go ahead, create one more component, and I call it child component, and I submit it. Okay, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna define another attribute in my child, and we don't really need to give this a default value. So this is a separate component from our main component, right? And this also has an attribute of the name text in here. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna have this input field inside of my child component. So something like this. And we're gonna do it like child component example. Okay, so now once we have defined this second component of ours, let's do the same thing. Let's say child value, and we're gonna print out the dot text in here. Okay, so this is our child component and this is our parent component. So the first thing to note is an introduction to using child components. So every component is reusable, right? So in order for you to use this child component in your attribute example, you would do it like this. You'll say C colon child component, and then since the child has an attribute of the type text, we can specify any attribute values like these, and we are passing this parent's text attribute in the child's text attribute, if that makes sense. So what this should do is this should put the body of this whole child component in your parent. This should pass this parent's text parent's text attributes value to your child's text attribute. So let's go back to our example. Okay. So now this value, the topmost value is in our parent. Let's put parent in here. This is our parent, and if I change the value in my parent, it also gets changed in my child, as you can see. Right? It's being updated everywhere. Now, the reason why it's being updated in the child as well is because we have used a bound expression while passing the value from the parent to the child. So let's say change this to an unbound expression. Now, if we go back, I can change the value, but you'll see that changed value is only reflected back in the parent. But if I change the value in my child, so it is still being reflected, but only in the child level. What I mean by that is, like, if we go to the child component, so since this is a bound expression and this is a bound expression, so any changes I make in my child, that is updated. But when we pass this attribute from the parent to the child, here it is an inbound expression. So any changes in the child are reflected in the child level, but they're not passed back onto the parent level because we have used an unbound expression here. All right, and same thing goes for any changes in the parent level. It is reflected only in the parent level, but anything is not passed down to the child level because of this unbound expression. So I hope you guys understand how bound and unbound expressions work. I'll suggest that you guys build out some examples for yourselves and test it out in action. And that's it for this video. Hope to see you guys in the next video.